Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I see a few more participants coming in, so I'm just going to give this a few seconds here before we officially get started. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I think you're in for a real treat. While we're waiting for participants, while I see more joining, I'm going to introduce myself and our other moderator tonight, and then our presenter. So my name is Wendy Wegman, and I am the Senior Director of Programs here at the Tourette Association of America. Thank you so much for being here. We're happy to bring you these presentations and this webinar in particular in cooperation with our cooperative agreement with the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Tonight, we're bringing to you Navigating Challenges to Help Your Child Achieve Success. Before I continue to go on, I want to have my co-moderator, Eric G, introduce himself. Eric, if you could introduce yourself, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, hi there. My name's Eric. I'm an intern with the Tourette Association of America. I trained as a rising leader in 2023. Have been involved with the Tourette Association ever since, doing kind of education as an education volunteer, and this past year interning with the organization. So it's been really awesome.
Thank you, Eric. And Dr. Lichtman, I had your bio pulled up, but because I'm sharing the screen here, I'm not able to access the bio that I have pulled up. So if I could just get, like, if you could do us the honor and introduce yourself, and please, tell us as if I were reading your bio about yourself, because you deserve those accolades as well. So it's my honor to present Dr. Lichtman, who is the Director of Student Mental Health Services at Touro University. And he does have a very impressive background, and it is a really great treat to have you here tonight. So Dr. Lichtman, please, anything else you need to say about yourself? And,
Sure.
and then we'll go on with the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Wendy and Eric, and thanks for setting this up. Um, so, just a little bit about myself. I'm a psychologist. I've worked with children with Tourette syndrome over the years and with the schools that they have attended. Separately from that, I've been a psychologist in schools and a principal in schools. So I sort of see both sides, if you will. And by the way, that's like, even setting it up that way, seeing both sides. There shouldn't be both sides. But in reality, pragmatically, there are both sides. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later tonight. So I've sat on both sides of the desk. How about, perhaps let's say it that way. Perhaps most importantly of all, I'm the father of Jeremy Lichtman. Jeremy, who's in his, I want to say early 30s, but I'd be lying. He's already in his mid 30s. I make all of my children, I make everybody younger than they are. But so he's in his mid 30s. He has Tourette syndrome, comorbid with ADHD, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Also, Tourette's comorbid with other, together with other challenges. Jeremy is also married with an almost terrible 3-year-old who I love terribly, and with another child, please God, on the way. And he is a psychologist in his own right. And so I think that certainly being a parent has certainly informed my experience and my practice and so on. So that's a little bit about who I am. And with that, shall we begin? Should we go right into things, Wendy? Okay.
Yes, absolutely. I'll advance to the next slide. And before I do, I want to let the audience, yeah,
Actually, let's not advance to the next slide just
yeah,
yet. Okay.
yes, absolutely. Right before I do, I want to let the attendees know that throughout the presentation, you're welcome to put questions in the Q&A panel. You'll see that at the bottom of the screen. Dr. Lichtman is leaving plenty of time at the end of the presentation to answer all questions and just have a lovely discussion. So anything that you think of during, please put it in and know that you'll have the opportunity after. I believe the chat should be shut off for audience participation, but we will be putting resources for you in the chat. So again, use the Q&A as you go for the presentation, and I will advance to the next slide.
Actually, let's wait if we can, Wendy. Okay. So let me just briefly tell you what I hope we will do tonight in the next little while. Um, so we're going to initially we're going to start to talk a little bit about Tourette's syndrome, and the different ways that it can manifest, and the different ways that it can manifest, especially in a school setting, right? Because that's what we're talking about tonight, is how we can help our children. We're focused on school, right? That school is not the only dimension of your child's life, but it certainly is a very important dimension, and that's what we are here to talk about and focus on tonight. So we're going to talk about Tourette's as it relates to school. We're going to talk a little bit then about the different perspectives of the people involved with your child in school, starting with your child themselves, their perspective, really important. Sometimes all of us adults are so busy, trying to support a child and to work with the child, that we leave the child out. Important not to leave the child out. So what's the child's perspective? What's your perspective as a parent? Not necessarily the same thing at all. In fact, I can tell you definitively, it's almost never the same thing. The perspective of the teacher, the classroom teacher, other educators, and certainly administrators and so on. And then from there, we'll discuss some broad strategies for how to navigate school, right, in a way that can help hopefully bring the most success to your child, how to navigate school, notwithstanding challenges that can often exist. And then, as Wendy mentioned, then we'll leave time for questions and discussion after that. Okay? So with that said, now, if you don't mind, let's move to the next slide. Right, the child. So, well, actually, one more thing. You can leave it on this slide, but let's talk a little bit about Tourette syndrome. Now, you might be thinking that why is he talking about Tourette syndrome? We're all parents of children who have Tourette syndrome. We all know about Tourette syndrome, so what do you need to know? And respectfully, I want to point out to you that whatever you know about Tourette syndrome is primarily what you know about your child and their Tourette syndrome. And that's not Tourette syndrome. And probably the biggest challenge that exists in special education, in the broad world of special education, and with the many different learning challenges and disorders that children can present with in school, is that when anybody knows a child with Tourette syndrome, or a child with autism spectrum disorder, or a child with a language-based learning disability, they of course think they know about language-based learning disabilities, but they really don't. They only know about that child who has a language-based learning disability and how it manifests with that child. And so even you as parents, no matter how much research you've done, no matter how much knowledge you've got, it's seen primarily through the filter of your child, as it should be. You need to see, your child primarily for who your child is, because you are your child's best advocate. At the same time, tonight we have to zoom out a little bit and try to take a broader perspective and see how other people, including your child themselves, how everybody else, sees them. And to understand, again, Tourette's is I mentioned a minute ago, autism spectrum disorder. Unfortunately, autism is the only category of special needs that is called a spectrum disorder. But in point of fact, every area of disability and challenge is a spectrum disorder. You can have whatever it is, more mildly, you can have it more moderately, you can have it more severely. And even that only begins to scratch the surface. You can have ADHD, you can have a child who has mild symptoms in some areas in executive functioning, and much more severe symptoms with regard to hyperactivity, or vice versa, or any combination of things. And that, by the way, it's that fact that each child is a unique child, and that every disorder is a spectrum disorder that plays itself out, if you will, a little bit differently, or sometimes a lot differently from one child to another, means that we need to look at each child individually, and that's really hard. It's easy for you as the parents. It's hard for everybody else at first blush to see your child, initially beyond, frankly, the diagnosis or the label that they're getting. Okay, so really important to remember, spectrum disorder can manifest so differently. And so even later in the discussion, later tonight, right, some of you might ask questions and make comments about your child, and everybody else is going to be evaluating and saying, oh, that sounds just like my child. And even if it does sound just like your child, it's not just like your child. It might be more like your child than others, might be less like your child than others, but it's not just like your child. And forgive me for, if you will, for belaboring the point, but I think it's really, really important that you appreciate and understand that's the reality. Each of our children, and by the way, with Tourette's, almost more than anything else, Tourette's, by its definition of having tics that wax and wane, right? That's part of the definition. They come and go. A blessing and a curse, by the way, right? Really a blessing and a curse, right? How many teachers over the years, I can tell you all the teachers, who I've interacted with over the years, who have told me that a child, including my own, they don't have Tourette syndrome because they don't have any tics. They've been in my class for 2 weeks now. No tics. They have Tourette syndrome. So the point is, again, that we need to really remember that it's a spectrum disorder and will manifest differently. One last thing about Tourette's, and then we'll move on, and that is that Tourette's, like again other areas of disability, can be comorbid. Fancy jargon, professional jargon. Comorbid simply means they can have another area of challenge together with Tourette. Doesn't have to mean that, right? You can just have Tourette syndrome. At the same time, it is not unusual, and the statistics vary depending upon what research you look at, but certainly there's a significant number of children and adults who present with, who have Tourette syndrome, who also have another area of disability with it. Learning disabilities are often common, or amongst the more common challenges that can be with Tourette's. ADHD, right? Attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, not uncommon. Those are probably the two most commonly found with Tourette syndrome. And so, right, again, your child might have Tourette syndrome. Somebody else's child might have Tourette syndrome and ADHD. And by the way, it's even for a really experienced professional who's got lots of experience working with the population or populations, it's sometimes hard to tease out and figure out a symptom or symptoms. Are they being caused by the Tourette's, or are they being caused by ADHD, let's say? And you might be thinking, well, does it really matter? As long as they're there. We got to deal with them. Yes, we need to deal with them, but subject to where they emanate from, if you will, right? Subject to where they're coming from, may in fact significantly modify the intervention that we would use to support the child. So it is important to understand, and again, it can be hard sometimes to know. So the takeaway here, right, is your child is unique. Thank God they're unique, right? Every child is unique. And then our children, to be very blunt and candid, our children are a little more unique than the children who don't have Tourette syndrome, right? And each one of them with Tourette syndrome is unique unto the next. And so please, when you hear in general, not just tonight, but when you talk to other parents, and that can be, networking can be, amazingly helpful and supportive, you have to do it with a filter a little bit, right? You have to take whatever anybody else tells you about their experience with a grain of salt, right? Because their experience cannot possibly be identical to your child's experience. Your child is different. And then the last thing, really the last thing I promise about this, is we haven't even talked about that. How, again, I said it, but now let me emphasize, your children are all different, as children, having nothing to do with Tourette syndrome or anything else, right? They have unique personalities. They are different. Thank God they have unique personalities. That's what makes them the special, lovable children that they are to you, and hopefully to many other people. So again, just please try to keep in the back of your mind, maybe in the middle of your mind, the that all of our children are different. So, and now let's turn to the next part, which is looking at the different perspectives, and let's start with the child. So the first question I think that we need to ask ourselves is, where, no, I'm sorry, Wendy, can we go back? We're not up to the teacher yet. Right, perfect, thank you. So the child, right? Anything, any concerns, any, doesn't even have to be a concern as such, but anything that we want to do with the child should really start with the child. Let's not make assumptions even about our own children. You as parents, and by the way, forgive me, I'm assuming that everybody who's here participating as a parent, you might be a grandparent, you might be an adult sibling, but so I'm going to say parents, but any relative, guardian who is attending, your child or the child that you're here for better than anybody else. At the same time, there are different perspectives, and only some perspectives about your child. You don't know all of them. You're not in school with them. You're not on the bus with them. You're not necessarily on the playground with them, right? You're not even when they're home, right? I hope that they're in their room sometimes, playing with their friends or out in the backyard playing with them, and you're not necessarily there. And you shouldn't necessarily be there, right? That's part of, of being a child and of growing up and learning to interact and play with one another. So you see better than anyone else, you see more than anyone else, but you do not see the entire picture. And so it has to start with the child. So if you've got if you wonder, is your child, getting the supports they need in school? Why would you call up the school? Why would you call up the teacher even before asking the child, right? If your child has an IEP, and presumably all or most of the children that you're representing would have an IEP, an individualized education plan that allows them to access, right, support services. So let's say in the IEP, they're supposed to go out for speech therapy, just as an example, right? Or they're supposed to go out for counseling once or twice a week, whatever it might be. If you're wondering, is your child getting that service? And you should always, by the way, don't assume because it's on their IEP that they're necessarily getting the service. Let me say that again. Because it's on their IEP doesn't mean that they're necessarily getting the service. So you should wonder and want to know, are they getting the service? And you should want to know, are they getting it the 2 times a week that the IEP might say, or are they only getting it once a week, right? Are they getting it twice a week as individual counseling, which is what the IEP says, or are they getting it once a week as individual counseling and once a week in a group, right? Now that might be wonderful, but that's not what the IEP says. But you want to know, are they receiving the services? And it should start with the child. Now, obviously, there's a developmental piece here. If your child is 6 years old, it's going to be, relatively speaking, harder, to get that kind of information from a child. But by the time a child is, I'm going to say 8 years old, I'm just picking that age semi-arbitrarily. So it's an 8-year-old, typical 3rd grader. At that point in time, you should be able to ask most 8-year-olds, what's going on in school, and they should be able to articulate. Now, they may not, based on personality, based on just being kids, they might say nothing, right? What'd you learn in school today? Nothing. What'd you do in school today? Nothing, because that's an often go-to response, for kids. But asking the question in the right way at the right time should be able to elicit information. So it's got to start with the child. What about, is your child having tics, right? I assume that you talk to your child about their tics, right? Maybe they're having tics at home, maybe they're not. Often, if they're having tics at home, they're probably having them in school also. So you might want to ask your child, do you have tics in school? When do you have? Right? If a child is in middle school, for instance, right, and it's departmentalized, as it is typically in most middle schools. So if they're in 6th grade and math is separate and language arts is separate and social studies is separate. So you might ask them, oh, so when do you know, like, can you remember when do you typically have ticks? Do you always have it in math, first period in the morning? Do you always have it in social studies? Do you always have it lunchtime? When do you have it, etc.? These are the kinds of things that you want to have, I think, open-ended conversations with your child about to try to understand, what's going on in school. Um, Again, let me emphasize the developmental considerations that you need to take into account. You don't have to be a developmental psychologist or a developmental pediatrician, but you do have to keep in mind that a 5, 6, 7 year old, right, are, more or less in one developmental stage by the time, again, that they're, 8, 9, certainly by the 10, 11, they're entering pre-adolescence, and things change. And you need to remember that your child changes and grows. Sometimes there may not be physical manifestations of that growth and change. That doesn't mean that they're not changing and growing. And even when they're younger, right, they are still, we want them to change and grow. I'm going to digress for a second and tell you a quick story. I mentioned my son Jeremy, so I'll mention him again. When he applied to college, so there was one particular school that he wanted to go to, and he applied to the honors program, and that university had the way they um, um, I guess took in students or didn't take in students was they would have all the students who were applying to the honors program would come on one of several days. So one day I took him there, and they would put them into groups of 3, as I recall it. And so 3 students would like go through the day together, meeting with different professors, different programs in the university, whatever it was. Now, hold that in your mind. And when I took him that day, when I dropped him off, this was my understanding of one aspect of Jeremy. Jeremy, thank God, had friends, had lots of social relationships, had good peer relationships, etc. At the same time, Jeremy did not talk to adults. Okay? Now, through his childhood, he just didn't talk to adults. Like if other adults came over, if parents came over, he would, not barely answer yes, no, etc. So he's now applying to college. My perception is that he does not speak to adults. By the way, it was a shared perception on the part of my wife. He didn't talk. I mean, he would talk to his teachers in school because he had to, but he, in general, did not speak to adults. Okay. I happen to know somebody in the admissions office at this university. At the end of the day, I asked them, oh, so, how was, how do you think it went for Jeremy? And long story short, he basically went on to tell me, oh, Jeremy was the belle of the ball. The other 2 kids that he was going through this program were really pretty quiet, wallflowers. He was talking and asking questions and et cetera, et cetera. It blew my mind. It was a completely different perspective of my child, who I had a good relationship with, who I thought I knew. But you know what? I had stopped knowing one aspect of him. He had grown up, and he had evolved, and he had changed, and my perception had not evolved or changed. And that's the point, is that you know them best, but you don't know them completely. And so you want to stay up with the evolution, right? With their change. You want them to change. Today they may not speak to adults. Doesn't mean that tomorrow they may not start talking to adults. Today they may not have so many friends. They may just have 1 or 2 good friends. And in 2 weeks they may start to have, oh so many friends. Children change and grow. And thank God they change and grow. So we need to be detectives, and we need to remember that what we know is only part of the picture. You keep hearing me say that. So the developmental considerations are right, as they go through different stages, right? That in itself is a cause for evolution and change. And so let's keep that in mind. I said, let's focus on the child, therefore, right? Let's focus on the child and start with them. But then you do also sometimes need to go to other people to get additional information. Whatever your child is telling you may not be the whole picture either. It's your child's perspective, and maybe they're not articulate, or maybe they're not, comfortable talking about it, or maybe their perspective is really just their perspective, and actually is not the way that others are viewing it. Doesn't mean that it's not an accurate perspective. It's an accurate perspective for them. And that's crucial because they're at the center of this, right? It's all about them, but it's not all about them completely. It's not. And so just think about who else are you going to get information from, right? Could be from the teacher, right? That would often be the next step, sometimes from other children. And here's another one that I want to point out to you that parents are often reluctant to get information from, but I think are a great source of information, and that's siblings, particularly older siblings. So if your child with Tourette syndrome, is blessed with an older sibling, they often know your child or can know your child in ways that you don't, right? They may be on the school bus with them and see that, again, that they're in the back of the bus playing games, talking to other kids, and you think that no, they just sit curled up on the seat because last year, one time when you got on the bus, that's the way they were that day. Not anymore. Siblings, see them in school sometimes. Siblings see them in the playground sometimes, right? Siblings just see them differently. Siblings really can be such a source of information. And by the way, it may confirm what you think you know about your child, or it may enrich, enhance, or change what you know about your child. So those are some. So it starts with the child, right? It should always start with the child, and what the child's perspective is. But you want to gather as much information as possible to understand and to really get the best picture possible. So now, Wendy, let's go to the next slide. And let's talk about the classroom teacher, right? Because the classroom teacher is after the child probably the next single most important variable in the equation of how it's going, and for your child. The teacher has huge power. It's really interesting. I train teachers, amongst other things, and teachers as a group often think that they are powerless or have limited power. That self-perception is completely inaccurate. They have a huge amount of power, not complete power, but they have a lot of power. And you want to know, it's really important for you to understand how the teacher views your child in the context of the class, how the teacher views your child in the context of just themselves. Who are they? Do they know your child? What do they know about your child? How do they know about your child? Do they know about your child because the school gave them, the evaluation or the IEP, and that's the sum total of what they know about your child? Did they ever have a conversation with your child? Did they ever take your child aside and sit with them for a few minutes and talk to them and try to build a relationship with them and try to understand what they like and don't like and others, right? And you can have a conversation with the teacher and pretty quickly, in most cases, can figure out, does this child know your child, or do they know your child on paper? Not the same thing. Or do they, or do they really know your child? Again, so that's about your child, but then what do they know about Tourette's, right? What do they know about Tourette syndrome? And, this is a little bit the cup half full or half empty. When my son Jeremy was going to school, when he was in elementary school 25 years ago, give or take, really nobody knew about Tourette syndrome. I mean, really nobody knew about it. And what they knew about it, if they knew anything, was really very skewed and negative. It's changed, and partially due to the good work of the Tourette's Association, and others, and parents, getting the word out, and for a whole host of reasons, it's changed, but it's only changed so much. There are many more people who have some greater knowledge and familiarity and awareness of Tourette syndrome. but there's still so much ignorance out there. So much. Sometimes ignorance, which is literally the slate is blank. I've never had it. I'm a teacher. I've never had a child with Tourette syndrome. I've never met a child with Tourette syndrome. I don't know anything. By the way, that may not be so bad. I'd rather start with a clean slate than with the teacher who may have had one child 7 years ago, and that child had ADHD, and that child presented with what the teacher perceived or understood as significant behavioral challenges, and therefore, oh, yeah, oh, thank you for giving me your child now. Now I'm going to have more behavioral challenges in my classroom because of that one experience that I had. So it's important to, at some point, to gauge what experience has the teacher had, good or bad, right? What knowledge do they have? And then we need, and I'm saying we, I'm using that term advisedly, we need to think about, okay, assuming they don't know, and most of the time they don't know. I'm going to say it again. Most of the time they don't know. Even if they have had a child or two over the years, that's just a child or two, right? And it's not your child. And that doesn't mean that they really broadly understand the spectrum, again, of Tourette syndrome. So let's start with the assumption that they know relatively little. And how can we then educate them in a meaningful, respectful way to Tourette's, about Tourette syndrome and about your child who has Tourette syndrome? Not exactly the same thing, but two shades, if you will. And so you have to think about who is going to educate them. And now I'm going to go back to the child for a second, right? Depending upon the age of the child, sometimes the child is ready, willing, and able to talk to the class, including the teacher. Should start with talking to the teacher about their Tourette syndrome. Again, I can't emphasize to you enough. When I train teachers, their go-to is rarely, if ever, going to the child. I have to hammer into them that when a child is, presenting with anything, why are you going to the school psychologist? Why are you calling the parents for that matter? Did you first sit down with the child? If a child is acting in whatever way in class, did you spend a couple of minutes at least to go to the child and say, hey, I noticed, you didn't seem to be attending. You seemed to have difficulty focusing, whatever it was. Were you having difficulty understanding? What can you tell me? And again, most children, right? A 5-year-old is going to have a little more difficulty. For a 5 or 6-year-old, you maybe need to, put out a menu of, was it this? Was it that? Was it something else? By the time a child is 8 years old, most of them overwhelmingly can say, well, you know what, I really didn't understand, or I didn't hear the first thing that you said, and then I couldn't follow, or, whatever it is that they're going to say. And it should start with them. And sometimes you as the parent may need to help remind the teacher to have a conversation with the child, So who's going to educate? Again, no matter who's going to educate the child, the teacher, the child should always be part of the program to educate the teacher, in my opinion, unless the child doesn't want to. We need to respect if the child says, I'm not comfortable, mommy, you do it. You talk to the teacher. I don't want to. Okay, fine. Although even there, I want you to know I would gently encourage. Say, how about sweetie, what if we do it together? How about if mommy comes in or we get on a Zoom with, you and me, and we'll talk to to your teacher about it together, because you know so much about, what's going on with you, because this is about you, Sarah, or you about, David, or whoever it might be. So let's try to always, the first port of call should be the child, and involving the child in a meaningful way, as long as they're willing to, and able to be involved. After that, you have to think, should you be the person educating them? Maybe. Should it be somebody else? Should it be an outside? Should it be somebody from TAA, right? Tourette's Association has staff who can come in, or has volunteers who are professionals, who have training and knowledge. And sometimes sometimes, let's be honest, as parents, this can be very emotional for us, right? You can go to a meeting with a teacher, and the teacher might say, I don't, like, maybe I'm being a little extreme here to make the point, but the teacher says, so tell me, and you could have a reaction. What do you mean tell you? Why don't you know? Why do I have to teach you? If that's going to be your reaction, then you shouldn't be the one as the parent educating them. Then let's bring in somebody else who can be emotionally, not distraught, frankly. And listen, I'm a parent. I said that to you at the beginning. I'm telling you, I know how challenging it is can be. I have testified at hundreds of cases for other parents. I've gotten emotional sometimes for other children and families, experiencing this. So how much more so when it's our own child, right? And when it's our own child, all bets are off. So that doesn't mean that you can't be the person to educate the teacher, but you really want to think about it. Is it you? Is it somebody from TAA? Is it a professional that you trust, that you work with, that knows your child and that knows Tourette syndrome, that you want to ask? Maybe you have a private speech therapist who works with your child, who's been working with your child for a couple of years, who really knows your child, right? Maybe, and you want to ask them to come in and talk about the strength that your child has, not starting off with the child, the strength that your child has, as well as perhaps some of the challenges. And most important of all, what are interventions that they've used? What are supports that they've used in the past that seem to have worked with the child, right? Doesn't mean they're going to continue to work, because our children are constantly changing and evolving and growing. And so what worked last year might not work this year. On the other hand, it might, and that should be the starting point. So really important, to sort of take the pulse, take the temperature of where is the classroom teacher? What is their perspective, right? Do they know? Don't they know? And what's their perspective, themselves in relation to working with your child? What's their perspective about your child? And what's their perspective? This is important. What's their perspective of your child in the context of the class? Really important. Today, there's hardly a school. I'm talking about mainstream schools, public schools, private schools, doesn't matter. Every school talks about individualizing. Oh, we individualize instruction. We support each child's unique needs, etc. That is mostly a bald-faced lie. Absolutely not true, in my experience. But I'm going to be arrogant for a second and say, not just my experience. I know it is a bald-faced lie. I've worked with hundreds, thousands of teachers over the years. Teachers teach. It's funny. Again, when I train teachers, and I'll ask them, I'll ask them, who do you teach? What do you teach? And the first thing they'll say is, oh, I teach third grade, or I teach math, or I teach fifth grade math. And I quickly try to tell them, with all due respect, you're completely, that should not be your perspective as teachers. Your perspective should be, I teach children. I teach children. I teach 8-year-olds. I teach 14-year-olds. I don't care what you're teaching a child. I don't care what the curriculum is. Curriculum is important, but that's secondary to the child. But it is important for you as parents to recognize that the framework that teachers are coming from is that they teach a class. So if you're asking them to worry, to focus on your child, their go-to is, I have 20 other kids. Now, there are occasionally teachers, and maybe you've been blessed with some of them, who have great instincts, or who are great teachers who really do individualize. And if you've had that experience, that's amazing. We should only have more of those experiences. In my experience, overwhelmingly, teachers are not like that. And they tend to teach to the class, to the group. When I say to them, if you haven't spoken to the child, how can you form any opinion without having at least spoken to the child? Their go-to response to me is, I don't have time. What am I supposed to do with the other 19 children? When do I have time? Now, that's when I start to break it down for them and explain to them what they should already know, which is that you do have time. Let me explain to you how you have time. Let me explain to you how you can be structuring your class. Class shouldn't only be frontal lessons. When you divide up the class into different groups, right? You have different reading groups, you have different math groups. That's an opportunity, for instance. Anyways, the point is just for you as the parent to recognize where the teacher is coming from, the teacher themselves, who they are, what they've experienced, both in and out of the classroom, is a significantly contributes to their perspective, right? Whatever little experience they've so far had with your child is another, and the fact that typically they tend to look at this as a class. Okay, so those are some of the things that I think we need to think about when we're talking about the teacher. So let's go to the next slide and turn to another important variable. We spoke, right, thank you, exactly. So we're focused on the child. We start with the child, then we go to the teacher, and then there are administrators. And administrators have the least to do with your child and have the most to do with your child, right? Administrators are not in the class every day. They're typically not interacting with your child on any regular basis whatsoever, nor do they need to be. At the same time, they are often directing the classroom teacher. They are responsible for the gestalt, for the school program and what's going on. And so administrators can play a very important role, right? What their attitude, I said to you before, what's the teacher's attitude, right? How was that attitude formed? Have they had children in their class who, with special needs before? Have they had children with Tourette Syndrome before? Do they have any relatives, with challenges and so on? Well, the same thing applies to administrators, right? What's been their experience in their personal lives, right? What's been their experience in their professional lives? Most administrators were teachers before they were administrators. So who did they have in their classrooms when they were teaching before they became administrators? And again, knowledge is power, right? Before you start asking for things, before you start asking to modify things, to change things, you want to know who are you dealing with, who you're working with, hopefully, right? And so you want to take the pulse. Who is this administrator? Who is this assistant principal? Who is this director of special education? Who is this school psychologist? Who's the principal? Whoever it is that you're working with, right? Who are they? What have they experienced? And it's fair for you to say, I'm just curious, what's been have you ever worked with any children with Tourette syndrome before? Have you had children with Tourette syndrome in your school before? Okay. Their perspective can meaningfully influence in either direction teachers, right? Their attitude, and I want to digress for a second. I believe in life that it's 9 out of 10. It's mostly about attitude. If you have the right attitude, I think you can move mountains and achieve almost anything. And if you don't have the right attitude, I think you're dead in the water. So if you've got an administrator, if you've got a school principal who's got the right attitude, who loves the children in their school, who really cares about the children in their school, who wants to hear what your concern is, who may have had experience or didn't have experience, but cares about all of the children who are in their purview, great. Then you're blessed. If they're not like that, then maybe we can nudge them in that direction, right? Maybe you can help to educate them. And again, are you the person educating them? Is it a previous teacher? Is it maybe another school administrator? Maybe your child was in an elementary school and is now moved into middle school, right? And maybe you had an amazing experience with the elementary school principal, and maybe you could ask the elementary school principal to connect with the middle school principal to tell them the amazing things about who your child is and the very successful experience they had. And again, what has worked in the past for your child or not. It is, right? This elementary school and middle school that's in the same district, you would think, of course they talk to each other. Of course, the elementary school, as they hand on the children to middle school, tell the middle school all about the children. That's what you would think, right? And you would be mostly wrong almost all the time. They do not do that. They do not do that. If they do anything, it's to point out who they think are the troublemakers. Maybe, maybe. And it goes both ways, by the way. Education tends to be a very hierarchical system. And very often, high schools to middle schools or middle schools to elementary schools, we don't want to hear, well, we got this covered. We'll take the child under on our wing and we'll figure out who the child is. There's almost a distrust, almost, or dare I say, even a lack of sufficient respect for the earlier, school division. So again, don't make any assumptions about anything. Don't make any assumptions that you worked so hard last year with the teacher and with the school, and you made so much progress and educated, and your child had an amazing experience because everybody was working together based on knowledge, based on your child, et cetera, et cetera. And now you're coming to a new school year, and of course they shared that. Well, of course they didn't share that. And don't assume that they shared it. At best, you could ask, did the lower school, did the elementary school share anything with you? Did previous staff who had worked with Johnny or Jane, share anything? And if not, then maybe let's arrange that. And I wouldn't, by the way, at that point, I would not even ask that middle school principal that I'm talking to now to please contact the lower school principal. I wouldn't trust them to do that. I would go back to my lower school principal, who I have some kind of relationship with already, right, and say, please, Wendy, do me a favor. Can you get on a call or a Zoom or whatever it is, and can you talk to Mr. Schwartz? Can you talk to whoever it is, and please, give them a little bit of background. It would really be, and in most cases, they who have a connection to your child, right, and to you, will do so, and will follow. Okay, so those, I think, are the key players, if you will. And I don't mean that, cavalierly, quite the contrary. Though these starts, your child's perspective on what's happening or not happening, your perspective as a parent on what's happening or not happening, the classroom teacher's perspective on what's happening or not happening, and then the administrators. Now, listen, I could go on. I could talk about what about the other children in the class. I could talk about related services personnel. But these four, I think are the four to primarily focus on: child, self, classroom teacher, and administrator. And if you don't, by the way, if you don't need to go to the administrator, if you can do it with the classroom teacher, great, even better. But you certainly want to take into account child, classroom teacher, and yourself. And by the way, this is where, if you are fortunate enough to be in a two-parent household, this is a good time sometimes for parents to talk to each other. You may not share the same perspective, right? Good time to check before mommy calls school or daddy calls school, whoever it might be. Are we on the same page? If you're not on the same page, maybe you want to, try to clarify some things before you, reach out to others. So, what are the priorities? What are the priorities? In life, you need to prioritize. If you're going to go into school, and I'm going to come to this in a minute, from a slightly different perspective, if you're going to be concerned about the IEP, if you're going to be concerned about the IEP and the actual related services and the instruction and where your child is sitting and what time they have, math and on and on and on, I think it's likely that you are not going to accomplish very much. Now, those 5 things that I just said really quickly might all be grist for the mill. They might all be reasonable things for you to have concerns about. But you cannot address all of them at the same time, and you cannot expect the school, the classroom teacher, or the school to address all of them at the same time. And therefore, we need to be the adult in the room right? And say, okay, these are 5 things. They're all important, but they're not all equally important. If you tell me they're all equally important, I will argue with you and tell you that's not true. And if you're saying they're all equally important, you're off base. We need to figure it out. You need to prioritize them. I will give you one example in terms of subjects. Okay, this is my bias. I think I'm right. It doesn't have to be your bias. You can come at it from a different perspective. But I don't believe all subjects are equally important. Language arts, math, science, social studies. Let's just take those major subject areas. To my mind, they're not equally important. For me, language arts, reading is the most important. That's number one. Math is number three. I don't even have a number two. For me, it's math is number three. And social studies and science are 4 and 5. For me, there is no question that the priority is reading and language arts because that colors everything else. If you have a child who, developmentally appropriately can read, can decode, can comprehend, can read independently, subject to their age and so on, etc., then they're able to navigate, a great deal of school and learning. But if they can't, then they're a little bit stuck in the water. Okay, so for me, science is important, but it is not as much of a priority as language arts. So you have to decide. I'm not telling you what your priorities should be, but if you've got those 5 things, right, they're not all equally important. So what's number one? What's number two? And what's 3 and 4 that we're going to put aside until we first address 1 or 2? And I'll say one more thing about this quickly. I think that when you're trying to prioritize, a piece of advice, I think there's 2 ways to prioritize. One is what's most important. So I just told you, for me, in terms of subjects, it's language arts. No question, hands down, not even a question. The other way to approach this is what's low-hanging fruit. I need to build relationships and I need to get wins. I need to win for my child. I need my child to win. Sometimes that's a smaller thing that may not be as important. It may not be the highest priority, but I can win it pretty easily. Success breeds success. So if I can get a win, if my child feels better, more, maybe just as importantly, if we can agree that the teacher's going to do X, which is easy for them, not so important, but it's easy for them, and they're successful, and they can walk away saying, "Wow, I did a great job. Wow, Johnny is really, he's really making improvements now." They're going to be that much more open and willing to put in effort and energy to go on to number 2, which might be more of a priority. So you got to balance. Those are the 2 things I think when you're prioritizing is what's most important, really, but also where can I get wins? Wins beget wins. When I'm successful, I'm more likely to be more successful. Okay, so let's go to the next slide, and we're going to talk now. We're going to, right, exactly. So what I was just saying is a good segue to this, right? What is the issue or the challenge that you're concerned about? You've spoken to your child, whatever it is. Maybe you were, on a class trip, right? You were the parent who went on the class trip, and you weren't comfortable with the way, the other children were treating your child, or you felt that your child was segregated, or whatever it is. Whatever the issue or challenge is, you got to clearly identify what it is. If there are multiple issues, then as I was just saying, you need to prioritize them. And you have to be very careful, I think, not to just come in with a laundry list of things. You come with a laundry list. If everything is broken, it's really hard for the person on the other end to hear what you have to say to them, right? And that's what's really important, right? Having nothing to do with Tourette syndrome now. Let's just talk communication. Communication between people is the most challenging thing in the world. Communication is really hard. That's what keeps psychologists and other mental health professionals, that's a big part of our business. It's what keeps us in business, is because people have difficulty communicating with each other. And one of the main reasons why we have difficulty communicating with each other is because we tend to be very focused on what we want to say. And we're not very good listeners. None of us are really good listeners. We're good talkers, not such good listeners. And then add to that, when you have concerns about your child, my child, you're not giving my child what they need. It feels like you're attacking my child almost by not giving them what they need, right? That's painful. And I go into mommy or daddy mode, and I got to protect them. And I got to make you understand what it is that you need to do to support my child. There's a person on the other end, right? And how are they hearing it? So if they're hearing it as very critical and nothing is right and nothing is working and you're not doing your job, it's very hard for them to hear. On the other hand, if you come and you say, listen, I do have several concerns, but today I'd like to talk to you about what my primary concern is. Sarah loves you. She thinks you're a great teacher. She loves the experience with you. But she also said, that she feels sometimes that she's kind of in the corner of the class and often, left out of class discussions, let's say, or whatever it might be. And so I really would like to talk to you about that. I'm sure that that's not, intentional, but, let's maybe we can talk about that and figure out together how it is that we can address this, right? So let's go to the next slide, Wendy, please. So you've identified the issue. Now let's talk about why is it an issue. And let's talk about the IEP for a second, because that's a good concrete way of looking at it. Is your issue that the IEP says that your child is supposed to be getting, let's go with counseling. Your child's supposed to be getting counseling, individual counseling twice a week and group counseling once a week. 3 times a week, twice individual, once group. In point of fact, to the best of your knowledge, your child is only getting once a week individual counseling. Is that your issue? To me, that's not a very potent issue. Tell me that why is your child supposed to be getting counseling, right? The counseling, it's not the service. There's a reason why they're supposed to be getting the service, isn't there? They're supposed to be getting counseling maybe because they have difficulty, they've had difficulty sharing, playing with other children, taking turns, taking other children's perspectives. Is that what it's about? Is that what counseling is working on? Is it they have difficulty with authority figures, read teachers and principals, whatever it might be? There is a rationale for why they're supposed to be getting counseling. So if you're concerned that they're not getting counseling and that the area of difficulty, right, they're having difficulty with authority figures continues to be presenting itself, oh, that makes sense. That's something that, that you really do want to talk to them about, and probably the teacher will be only too happy to want to talk about that. On the other hand, if you want to talk about, well, the IEP says they're supposed to be getting it 3 times. They're doing fine in class. They don't seem to have difficulties with authority figures anymore. They seem to be getting along fine with their peers. They have friends, but the IEP says 3 times, and therefore I'm entitled to it 3 times. I fought for it. I want it. So with all due respect, I would say I'm not, I'm not convinced. Really, I would tell you, please go back to the drawing board and think, is that really the priority? Maybe the priority is to change the IEP. Maybe we should change the IEP and focus in other areas where support would really benefit the child if they no longer need that support. And trust me, please, there are thousands of IEPs out there that that are supposed to be that are providing services to children who don't need those services. They might need other services, by the way, or maybe they don't even need service. Again, evolution, change, development, right? Kids don't stay in the same place. IEP stays in the same place for 3 years. That doesn't mean thank God children don't stay in the same place for 3 years. Hopefully. So again, you've identified the issue. You have to ask yourself, why is it an issue? Again, a good time, this is a good, parental, chat potentially to have. Again, if you have a trusted professional in your life, in your child's life, might be good to talk this out with them. And then I never, you know, when you come to, when you want to come to somebody with an issue, with a concern, if you have a solution, that's great. You don't have to have a solution. You're not the professional. It's not your job to have the solution, but it doesn't hurt if you do have. It doesn't hurt if you have a possible solution. Jenny said that she feels like, compared to the other children, she's hardly ever called on in class. Jenny feels that sitting in the back of the room, that she has a harder time, focusing in on the lesson, whatever it might be. So you could suggest, right, that maybe we could consider moving where Jenny's seat is, or Jenny is concerned, about her tics, and is embarrassed sometimes in class when she makes vocal tics, when she makes sounds. Do you think we could let her go out, and you the teacher and Jenny can have a signal when she's feeling uncomfortable, right? Sometimes she could feel the tic coming on. Maybe she doesn't, feel it coming on, but it's starting to come on, and she would like to exit for a couple of minutes and go to the bathroom and tick away if that's what she needs to do, and then come back. So, right, you could suggest that. That's great to come up, with that as a suggestion. Again, you don't have to, but to the degree that you have a solution that you would like, or or potential solutions, you certainly want to share them. So don't feel under pressure to have one, but again, you're your child's advocate. You know your child, and you want to try to, if you can, make suggestions. So now let's go to the next slide. Right, so we've identified the issue, we've prioritized, we've identified the issue. We're meeting with the teacher. Maybe we're meeting together with our child, with the teacher, and we've laid out, what the concern is. Now it's really important to listen carefully to what their response is. And by the way, it's important to listen carefully to their response out of respect, just for another human being. It's important to listen carefully out of respect for them as professionals. It's important to listen carefully to them because this is important information. You want to know what they're thinking. You want to know what their perspective is. And if they ask you further questions, either before they respond or as part of the response, then I want to urge you, when they ask you a question, to only answer the question being asked. We have a tendency, again, we're emotional about this, understandably emotional, and that's okay. And that's why you're here tonight, right? To talk about strategies. So here's one of my strategies. Try to only answer the question that's being asked. And that's for two reasons. It's for many reasons, but two main reasons. One reason is you don't want to overwhelm, right, the respondents. And let's say, in this case, the classroom teacher. They've asked you a question. They want to know about this. When does Jenny say she feels? Does she say she always feels not called on? Does she say, which time of the day does she feel like she's, feels like she's, going to have tics and would like to, go out of the room, etc. Whatever it is, try to answer that question. And by the way, if Jenny is there, let's always give Jenny first shot at answering the question. But if Jenny can't or is uncomfortable answering the question, then you can answer the question, but just answer that. By only answering that, you're clearer. We're more focused. And by the way, don't give away, you don't have to play all your cards. We said, I know you have other concerns, but now's not the time for those other concerns because we prioritize. Now we're focused on this concern. Okay, so there really are so many other things that we could talk about. But in a minute, I want to stop and throw it open to questions and comments and discussion. I just want to go to the next slide just to show you. If, sorry, my slides got oh, well, two more slides. So this on the heels of what I just said to you is right. You don't want to win the battle. Sometimes we can make a teacher do something. Right? I win the battle. We had a battle of wills, and I got them to do what I want. But are they doing it begrudgingly? Are they doing it unhappily? Are you winning that battle but losing the war? You don't want to lose the war. You need to take the long perspective, right? You need to see the big picture for your Jennies and Johnnies, right? It's a long year, right? You don't want to just win the battle. You want to win the war. You want to, over time, if it's possible, get that teacher to be your child's biggest ally and advocate, except for yourself. And even better, not even better, but even in addition to be your ally. P.S. Sometimes we're in a situation, I don't think this is most of the time, but I think we have to be real. Sometimes you're in a situation where you have a teacher who's just intractable, right? I know education. I know special education. I'm really not interested in what you have to say. I have a master's degree in special education, Mrs. Johnson, and you're not going to tell me how to teach my class or how to teach the children in my class. So I heard your concerns. I will continue to do what I think is in the best interest of all the children in my class. Then you need to think about, do I want my child in that setting? And there's lots of variables to consider in that. But I will just tell you, this is now Jeff Lichtman speaking, just me, just my personal opinion. I don't like to be anywhere I'm not wanted. And if I think that teacher doesn't want Jenny in her class, I don't care if the teacher doesn't want me in that class, doesn't want me, the parent. I can live with that. I can't live as a parent or a grandparent. I can't live comfortably knowing that my child is in a classroom with a teacher who doesn't want them in their class. And that happens sometimes. And you need to be aware as knowledgeable parents that it can happen. So everything else that we've said tonight earlier leads, up until this point. Are you at the point where you've come in, your husband has come in, your wife has come in, the lower school principal has come in and spoke, and everybody, and nothing is changing. Nothing is changing. Well, then maybe you really do need to think about, okay, what are my alternatives? What other classes are there? What other schools are there, right? School districts sometimes have more than one elementary school or more than one middle school, or more than one class in a grade, certainly. So just, the last, thing to consider, but something that does need to be considered. And now let's just turn to the next slide. Then I really promise I'm going to shut up for 2 minutes.
Hey, Jeff, the next slide I have is the questions.
Okay, so wait, then let me just tell you. Great.
Okay.
My
okay,
bad. So my last comment is just this. Again, there are other considerations. Other considerations are, we didn't talk at all about mainstream education versus special education, which is a huge question sometimes, right? We didn't talk about tests, which are often test taking, right? And test taking for children are often, one of the areas where there is, challenge or difficulty for a child who has Tourette syndrome. And we certainly haven't spoken about the schoolyard, recess, right? And interaction with peers and so on. And that's not because those are not important, but just in the context of one, session, I felt it was important for us to focus on, again, as I said, the child, yourself, the classroom teacher, and the administrator. And with that, let me stop and throw it open to you for your questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. We did have a few questions in the chat, so I can kind of just read them off in the order that they were sent in. So we had someone ask specifically about expulsion. the unfortunate situation for kids who get expelled because of their tics. The question is, how can we approach the principal so my child can be understood and have services? How do we tease apart the trauma and the symptoms of Tourette's? We have offered presentations and have sent resources from the TAA, but haven't been successful.
Okay. So I just, that is a terribly painful question to hear, but it's also a reality sometimes. So I just want to, in terms of that question, I think we have to separate out the trauma and the pain that the child and the parent that you're experiencing, separate from the situation that you're presenting. In terms of that kind of, look, I'm not a lawyer. When I was much younger, before I went to school, I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. And then I realized, no, I don't want to be a lawyer. I want to be a psychologist. I want to help people. Lawyers can help people too, but I'm not a lawyer. But I am somewhat familiar with special education law. And to the best of my knowledge, almost never, I never want to say never, so I'll say almost never should a child ever be allowed, I'm using my words carefully here, be allowed to be expelled because of tics. That is not a reason to be expelled. Now, that doesn't mean that schools don't do things that they're not supposed to do, that they're not allowed to do. They do it all the time, unfortunately. So if you've offered resources, if you've offered to collaborate, and the school has rejected that and simply out of hand, again, right? I'm just taking the little bit of information, that the potent information, but the limited information that you've shared. If that's the case, it seems to me that that's where you need to go to the child study team and to call it a child study team meeting. That's not something that you as a parent, once they're going to, that's like going from, like there are, what's it called, in battle, or like, in defense, there are, stages, right? There's DEFCON 1, DEFCON 2, DEFCON 4 is the stage before launching nuclear missiles. Expelling a child is like, loosing nuclear missiles. So if that's what the school has jumped to without taking other, appropriate, meaningful interventions before that, then it seems to me that you probably need to go to the child study team. There too, I think TAA can help in terms of, giving you, support, staff who can support you in terms of going to the child study team, who can understand with you what the situation is in advance, and then strategize with you about going to a child study team, calling a meeting, and even there, right? It's not just about, first it's about not having your child be expelled, but then now that they're in school, if they've expelled the child, well, what are they, you also don't want them back in school, but sitting in the principal's office or sitting in timeout the whole time, right? So what's the strategy? What are the expectations? What do we expect to change when they're back in school? And that you're going to really want to strategize, I think, with I would recommend with people from TAA before you go to the to a child study meeting. And I would, by the way, also recommend, if at all possible, never go to a child study team meeting by yourself. They are you have 5, 6, 8 people on one side of a table, all of whom do not know your child, or most of whom don't know your child, but profess to know your child in some sort of way, based on 1 or 2 interactions together, and you on the other side of the table. Before, you don't have to say anything else. Just think about that picture. It is terribly intimidating and uncomfortable. So, if you can go with the spouse, but also go with somebody from TAA. Every state also, by the way, every state has an agency. I don't think this has been shut down yet under the current administration due to the government shutdown. Every state has an agency that provides advocates free of charge to go with, to let you know what your rights are and to go with you to meetings. In New Jersey, it's called SPAN. In New York, it's called Advocates for Children, I think is the name of the agency. But every state has an agency. Those are resources that you should be you must utilize in a situation like you were asking about.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Before I get to the next question, I'm just gonna put in the chat our uh, post-presentation survey. We could just fill that out. That helps with our funding for our presentations. And it's just kind of helpful for us to kind of get an idea of who's watching our presentations, and any kind of feedback that you have. The next questions we had, someone actually had three different questions, but they're all kind of related together, so I'll kind of just ask them all together at once.
Okay.
The first one is, how do you educate a teacher that is unresponsive when you provide information on their disabilities? And along those lines, what should I do if a teacher treats the diagnoses as a character flaw instead of a disability? The last one is, what do I do if the teacher does not adhere to the 504 accommodations and only suggests that we punish at home for school behaviors?
Wow. Okay. Again, unfortunately, all too real. So, so first of all, um, how do you relate to the teacher? Look, you always want to try to start, right, from a positive, collaborative perspective. So I would start with cookies. You heard me, cookies. Um, what do I mean by it? Could be chocolate, you know. In other words, you know, um, you, you wanna you don't want to start off at odds with the teacher. You want to try to bring them over to you even before you start talking about it. So I'm not joking when I say, like, let's say you're meeting them in person, and meetings in person tend to be better, right? So if this is important enough that you want to, talk with the teacher about it, right? If possible, it's not always possible, but whenever possible, I would prefer to meet in person. It's much harder It is harder to be less receptive in person than it is on Zoom or by telephone. People are so much more passive aggressive in emails than they would ever be in personal interaction. And the same thing applies kind of here. So I would come to a meeting, and I'm not joking, I would bring a box of cookies or a box of chocolate, and I would, start off by, I'm sure it's really challenging. You have a class of 23 kids, and kids coming with different, every child is unique. And then now you have my child who also has Tourette syndrome, et cetera. So, thank you. Thank you for your service. It's funny. We say to first responders, right? Or certainly we say to service people, right? Isn't that the tagline always, whenever you see somebody, from the military, thank you for your service. I wish we would say the same thing to teachers. We really should. Thank you for your service. Their service is just as important as that of the military. And that's the way we should go in. That would be my suggestion to start off with. That's number one. Um, then, if they're not adhering to the 504, so I just want to remind you, is the 504 important for the substance of what it's going to provide, or is it important because you achieved the 504 and therefore you want it? If whatever the 504 is supposed to provide is really, as best as you know it, important for your child and their education, then I would leave off the 504 and try to focus with the teacher on why you, as the parent, why do you, Wendy, think it's really, really important for your child as part of the 504 to have extra time, for assignments? Or why you think it's really important for her or him not to work in a group larger than 2 or 3 children? Whatever it is, why is it important, right? And by the way, forgive me, I'm not trying to be cute here. I mean it. And if it brings tears to your eyes to explain it to that teacher, that's okay. That's really okay. So, right, you want to bring the human dimension. You want to bring Sally, Sarah, Jenny, Johnny, Eric, Jacob, whoever your child is, you want to, put them front and center in front of that teacher as much as possible. So don't think 504. Think my child, Eric, is overwhelmed when they're in a group with 4 or 5 other children. They come home and they cry, "Mommy, I can't. It's so hard for me when all the children, in the group are talking, etc." Paint a picture for the teacher of what your concern is and why. I didn't say a word about 504. Not a word. But I think I just began to paint the picture a little bit, right? So I think that's that's what you want to try to do. And if you're not making headway, then maybe you have to go back to the child study team, because the 504 is mandated, right? Once it's mandated, sometimes unfortunately that's where you need a child study team administrator to come in and tell the teacher, on whether we like it or not, this is what the child is entitled to, and therefore we must provide. And to that last, I think what the last question, if I'm remembering correctly, about thinking that it's a character flaw, whatever behavior or whatever is being manifested, the teacher perceives as a character flaw that should be dealt with at home and not in school. Wow. If that's really where they're coming from, number one, I'm a psychologist, right? I never know what anybody else is thinking. I'm supposed to. People think that we can, I don't know what's going on in somebody else's mind. So how can how can anybody know what is somebody else's character flaw versus a symptom of an area of difficulty versus, anything else? Okay. And how dare they say that? How dare they? But what that, that's number one. Number two is, the child's performance in school is the responsibility of the professionals in school, not the responsibility of parents. I say to teachers and to schools all the time, I don't understand. It happens all the time, but I don't understand why teachers and schools ask parents to discipline, for the most part, to discipline or fix things about about their child's performance in school when the parents aren't there. You're there. It's your job. It's not my job as the parent. You don't come into my home and tell me how to parent, and I won't come into the classroom and tell you how to teach. But if that's what the teacher is saying, then I'll go back to something I said earlier. If that's really where they're coming from, and if the chocolate, maybe it needs to be champagne. Well, probably not champagne. That's a little over the top. But, maybe it's chocolate and cookies. But if that doesn't win them over, and if you're crying and you're helping them to understand, better who their child is, your child is rather. If none of that's working and they just think it's a character flaw, then again, maybe your child needs a different teacher. And that's the obligation of the school. If the school is giving your child a teacher who thinks that they're making motor tics or they're calling out, is a character flaw? Calling out is not a character flaw. Calling out, I'm going to be overly simplistic now. Calling out in class is again, I'm being overly simplistic, but comes probably from one of two things. Okay? It either comes from an area of difficulty that the child has with impulsivity or something along those lines. That's not a character flaw. It's not a character flaw. That may be one of the symptoms of their ADD or ADHD, but that's not a character flaw. Or it may also be coming from a professional flaw that the teacher has in not knowing how to set up their classroom appropriately so that they are engaging children meaningfully so that it doesn't have to be about classroom management. There shouldn't be classroom management. There should be well-structured classes that support children so that there is very little, frankly, management that's needed. So it may be a teacher flaw, not a character flaw. And if we can't win the teacher over, first we want to win the teacher over, but if that's not possible, we can't win everything, right? Sometimes I need to take my child out. I need to go to the principal, the child study team, whatever it might be, and say, my child can't be with this teacher when this is their perspective. So that's what I would suggest.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah. Our next question is actually about IEPs, so a little similar to kind of the 504 discussion. But what do I do if my child was denied an IEP for having good grades, but is considered too disruptive for a normal classroom with a 504? They're saying that it's a gray area and how the teachers are threatening discipline.
Okay, wait. I just want to make sure I understand the question. So the child is should not have an IEP. The school is claiming because they're too smart, because they're too capable. However, their behavior, their performance, et cetera, in class is challenging, and a 50 whatever interventions they would put into a 504 are not sufficient. And right, and the school is saying it's a great area, and they don't know what to do. And did I get that? Is that basically the question?
I believe so.
Okay.
If the attending wants to
Okay.
add more information into the chat, feel
Okay.
free.
So
Yeah,
a couple of things.
I was gonna say, Jeff, I think what they're saying is that, exactly what the part that you got for sure with the IEP was denied for the good grades. But they can't be in a regular education classroom because they're too disruptive with just a 504. So
Okay,
they
got it.
have that 504, but they
Got
can't
it.
in that classroom.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, okay, I mean it's fascinating, except when it's your child. Okay, but it's fascinating. Grades have nothing to do with IEPs. Should have nothing to do with IEPs. You could have a child who's getting good grades who still needs an IEP. One thing has nothing to do with the other, okay? Or certainly very little to do with the other. So a school that is saying that, and schools say things like that all the time, is either ignorant, right? Or intentionally, not wanting to provide services which cost money, right? An IEP, right? Once you have an IEP is going to call for services, right? Is going to call for supports and interventions, and we don't want to do those because it's going to cost us more money or it's going to cost us more time and effort. Well, too bad, frankly. So, you may need to go in with somebody to help educate the school that the grades alone, if the grades are a consideration at all, it's only one consideration. And let me be clear again. You can have a child with a language-based learning disability, right? Some significant language-based learning disability. They have difficulty processing language. They have difficulty reading, etc., and still be getting good grades. And schools, again, either out of ignorance or out of poor intentions, do the wrong thing. So bottom line is, first of all, First of all, it's not you as the parent to own this. It's the school to own. Well, if a 504 is not enough and an IEP is too much, you're the professional. So what are you suggesting? It's not the parent who has to come up with the solution. It's the school. So I would throw it back that's the first thing I would do. Throw it back at the school. Oh, I see, because I'm collaborative. I understand. So what would you like to do? What would you like to do? That's number one. Number two, a school has the capacity without 504, without an IEP, to provide interventions and services. A school has the capacity to do that. A district has the capacity if they so choose. So you could also suggest to them, what if you're saying that it's X or Y or Z, why don't we try to give Johnny some support without an IEP? Let's give them that support for 2 months and let's see what happens. And then let's meet again and see, what we're thinking about, and is that support sufficient? And maybe that'll move the problem along to where it's not a problem. Or maybe that will move it along to where we say, oh, we should have an IEP and let's build in that on a more regulated basis, that intervention or support. But let's be very clear. It is the schools or school district's responsibility to come up with a resolution to this, not you, the parent. You just have to agree with the resolution, okay, and not be bulldozed not be taken advantage of because of their other agendas. And they always have other agendas. They're meeting with you about your child, but they have other agendas at the same time. And we need to be, there with our eyes wide open, to that. Look, I'm going to tell you, in my experience, 504s, whenever I work with a family, I try to shy away from a 504. Um, because I think that for the most, I find them not to be particularly helpful. I'm talking in very broad strokes. If a child has a diagnosis, right? IEPs are on the basis of diagnosis. 504, you don't have to have a diagnosis. IEP, you must have a diagnosis in one of the recognized categories of, of disability, whether it's, again, whether it's a learning disability or OHI, other health impairment, or whatever it might be. So if they're considering an IEP but don't want to give it, well, I would also be thinking about, well, do we have a diagnosis? If we don't have a diagnosis, maybe it's time, maybe you've waffled and wasted too much time. Maybe it's time for an evaluation now to determine if the child actually has an area of disability, right? Evaluation is supposed to be, relatively speaking, an evaluation is relatively objective. Either the child meets the criteria based on evaluation for a diagnosis of one sort or another, or they don't. If they don't meet the criteria for a disability, right, then they're not even eligible for, for an IEP, right? So there's a lot of things to consider here, I think, in this case. But what I would leave you with is two things. Number one is, this is not yours to own, and don't let the school give you ownership. Throw it back. Well, first, gently give it back to them. And if they don't gently accept it, then throw it back at them. Number one. And number two is, again, you need to go with somebody. You need to go with somebody who, just like I'm saying to you, well, you're talking about an IEP, but if we didn't do an evaluation, right? Why are we talking about an IEP or no IEP? And very often 504s are given because they don't want to do an evaluation, because an evaluation is expensive and timely and stuff like that, and they think they can get away with it. Well, okay. So they're saying the 504 is not enough. Good. Okay. Then that might suggest that there's a diagnosis. Now, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking again, well, maybe this is teacher disability as opposed to child disability. That's what I'm thinking in the back of my mind, but we're not going to say that. But certainly I would want to say that, okay, then maybe it's time for us to evaluate my child and let's see if, what's going on here. Is there an area of difficulty that meets the criteria for disability that would then help us to determine what kind of interventions, via an IEP we should be giving them. But go with somebody. Again, TAA, one of the advocacy groups, something, not by yourself. Next question.
Hi, Jeff. I answered one of the last questions in writing, but they were kind of general. So I just wanted to say a couple things, if that's okay with you, and feel free to add anything else on. People are asking, would my child qualify for an IEP? And another question here is about, the child perhaps losing the IEP because they're meeting their goals for their speech language, which what has given them the IEP. So I'm hoping that maybe we can kind of capture, because I know it's already after 8 o'clock, and I'm sure you've had a long day as well. And, it's so generous for you to be here. But I'm thinking maybe the last part of it, maybe we can capture how to request school evaluations, request reevaluations, and how to help parents. They don't always know, how to look at those evaluations and support. And before you answer, just so I don't forget, because I know it's getting late, I put in the chat to reach out to us at, because I know Jeff's mentioned that many times. It's support@tourette.org. I put it in the chat. We can help and support. I also put, Jeff mentioned centers. I put the name Parent Training Information Centers are in every state of the country. They can provide advocates that can help you look at these school evaluations, go to those 504 and IEP meetings too. And I put National Disability Rights Network. They're also in every state and they provide some free law advice, especially for some of those families that we had some really hard comments and situations here. So don't hesitate to reach out to those advocates or those lawyers when you have those really hard situations, really truly. Anyway, Jeff, back to the school evaluations. I'm going to let you talk about that.
Good. So just on the heels of what you just said, Wendy, let me just,
Yes.
before I do that, just say, look, if
Yes.
anybody has a question or, a situation, and you want to, you think that maybe I can be helpful in talking it out with you further, you're welcome to contact me through, through TAA. They've got my contact information, and I'm happy to, to try to speak to you. Having said that, let's talk a little bit, about the evaluation process. Now, understand, please, that this is complex, right? And I said to you at the beginning of this session, in talking about Tourette syndrome, that it's a spectrum and that each child, is unique and different. So when it comes to evaluations, again, every district is not the same as every other district, right? And there are a lot of considerations. But let me give you some things to a little bit of a framework to think about. The right to evaluate, every parent has an inalienable right, has a right to the evaluation of their child if they, the parent, by the way, parents don't have lots of rights. We don't. Okay? Don't think you have lots of rights. You don't. This is one of the few areas where you really do, though, have rights. Any parent at any time has the right to go to their school district and say, I suspect, I believe, I think that maybe my child has a disability and I need them to be evaluated. And it's almost as simple as one or two sentences. I'm concerned about my child. I think they may have a problem. I want them to be evaluated. I keep using different words purposely because put it into your words. You don't have to use any particular, there's no particular jargon or language. You just need to say, I'm concerned about my child and I want them evaluated. Now, and that is a right that you have for your child. And now, it's never so black and white because while that's your right, it's not their obligation to do it tomorrow. There's a whole time process, and it could take months till an evaluation is done. So now I'm going to say to you, when you request that evaluation, I would encourage you in the strongest terms possible, if you're going to request an evaluation, to request it in one of two ways. Either request it in writing that you bring to the school, go to the school, the district office, bring it in there and get a stamped receipt that says, okay, it's October 16th, 3:30 p.m., or at least October 16th, because that starts the clock ticking. They have X amount of time. It can't take 3 years to do an evaluation. It could take a couple of months, but and you want the clock to start ticking immediately. So either you bring it in yourself or you can send it by mail, but then please send it certified return receipt requested, which again means that the school has said that they've gotten it. An email, right? How do you know that they got the email? Now, you could send them an email, and if you send them an email and you ask them to please respond and acknowledge that they received, this email request from you, I guess that would probably be okay. But probably be okay. I know the first two never fail. If you need to bring in a special education lawyer or you need to fight with them, having that receipt or having that postal, return receipt requested is nobody can argue with that in terms of the clock ticking, right? And the clock is ticking, right? If you're asking for an evaluation, it's because you've got a concern of some sort and you want the evaluation. By the way, once the evaluation starts, it could take a couple of months till it starts. and then it could take a couple of months till it actually happens, right? Half a year can go by before you even meet with the child study team about their findings. Okay? So it's your right, but you're on the clock. So put them on the clock. The purpose of evaluation is to determine, based on criteria that the school district doesn't set, right? But that are set by the state and the state, federal government, as to what meets criteria for a learning disability, for an other health impairment. By the way, Tourette syndrome always qualifies as other health impairment. So it falls into one of the uniformly recognized categories. What it doesn't do, however, is it doesn't, if you don't have the evaluation, you're not determining, okay, so great. So they've got, they've got a diagnosis. We all agree that, but what's the issue? And what do they need supports or services in? So the evaluation is evaluating, okay, what's their capacity? What are their strengths? Not just issues of difficulty, but what are their strengths? What's their capacity? And what are the areas of weakness? And sometimes what's the disparity between, different significant areas? And based on that, then it is the child studies team, responsibility to come up with a draft plan and say, okay, we've evaluated your child. Here are the findings, and they meet the criteria. And again, so if your child has, you should just be aware, if your child has a diagnosis of Tourette syndrome, then they're pretty much, it's a shoo-in for that. But it's not necessarily shoo-in for what supports or interventions. That's the child study team based on evaluation. That's their job then to come up with, here's what we think. We think your child should have speech and language therapy for X, Y, and Z, right? And that for is an important question. Why are they recommending speech and language? Is it because they have difficulty with expressive language? Is it because they have difficulty understanding, language? Why do they want that service? Why do they want OT? Why do they want counseling? And schools sometimes will just give services without really thinking about, like, what's the purpose, where's the area of difficulty? And what's the purpose of the intervention in responding to the area of difficulty? And by the way, right, so it's the child study team based on evaluation that comes up with the draft plan. And now, by the way, the teacher comes into this also, the classroom teacher, who is saying, yes, Johnny can't sit still in his seat. Yes, Johnny never pays attention. Yes, Johnny's handwriting is worse than my doctor's handwriting, and we can't read anything that they say, et cetera. So that, sort of corroborating, enhancing, modifying, what the findings of the evaluation are, so that we can then say, okay, so the child study team is thinking about, we should do X, Y, and Z in this IEP. We should give these services, but not those services, etc. And then they call you in, right? And then you're part of it, and you have to agree to it as the parent or parent. And that's important. And if you don't agree with it, then don't agree with it, right? It's got to make sense to you also. And if you're not comfortable with it, okay, I feel like a broken record. If you're not comfortable with it, then I see Wendy just put something up, Pacer Bullying Prevention. Pacer's a great agency that's done some very nice work out in Minneapolis, I think it's based in, but but everything is national, international, whatever today. But the point is, there are resources out there, and really the first port of call, just contact. By the way, I hope that Wendy is happy that I keep saying this. I really don't, no, but I think the first port of call should be Tourette's, Association for, do you have somebody, here's my situation, who can I talk to about this? Who can come with me to a meeting? Who can you recommend to come to me with a meeting? Should I be speaking to a lawyer now? Should I be speaking to an educational advocate? What, right? Every situation is unique and different. Sometimes you're coming to them, you're coming to us, at the very beginning. Sometimes though, it's, the question asked earlier about expulsion, right? Like we're in the third quarter, maybe the fourth quarter of the football game, right? That's not the beginning here. So, like it might call for a much more robust response than somebody who's just beginning to have conversations with the school district. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a sense of of the evaluation process. I mean, it's really just the tip of the iceberg. Keep in mind individual, and keep in mind that it's a negotiation. After, once, the evaluation has been done, it's a negotiation. And there too, a parent has some influence, some power. They need you to sign off on, whatever it is that they're recommending, or they need you to sign off on whatever they're going to modify as their recommendation, right? They need parent buy-in ultimately, right? They have all kinds of auditing problems if you don't sign off on it. You must, and by the way, at these meetings, right, where 6 of them are sitting on one side and you're on the other side, so they often ask you, to sign, a paper, that you're there and everything else. My recommendation is never sign. Never sign there. Take it home. I just want to show it to my, I want to show it to my spouse. I want to show it to my father. I want to show it to my mom. I'm talking about the parent. I want to show it to the grandparent. I don't care who you want to show it to. I don't care if you're lying. Don't sign anything there under pressure. No matter what, even if you think you're cool, calm, and collected, you are under pressure. And they pressure you. It might be more, more of a hammer. It might be a more gentle silk scarf that they're, tying around your throat to get you to sign it. But they want you to sign it. You have the right, and I would suggest you take advantage of this, not to sign it. You want to go back and read it. You want to read it. You appreciate all the time and effort that they put into putting together this document as a blueprint for how we're gonna help your child move forward productively and meaningfully. And now you want to give it the time and attention that it deserves, right? So I've just bought into everything that I've lauded them and their process and everything else, and stroked their ego maybe, and so I want to really read it carefully and stuff like that, and then I'll be happy to sign it afterwards if you're happy to sign it afterwards, and then get help from TAA. I hope that gives you a little bit of a picture. And one PS, I think maybe Wendy or you started to say, or maybe there was a question about, again, that comorbidity when a child has Tourette syndrome, but they also have OCD, or they also have ADHD, or they have all 3, or whatever it might be. So those cases are obviously become often more complex, right? And you want to strategize with the people who are involved in your child's life in meaningful ways. That might be a therapist that you work with outside, of school. That might be a pediatrician who has been following your child. That might be somebody from TAA that that you've been working with over the last couple of years. Whatever it might be, you want to too many cooks in the kitchen is not good. But before that, right? That's when you're cooking. Coming up with the menu, you want a bunch of people, working, reflecting, thinking about what's the best way for me to win. And what do I want to win? I want to win what's in the best interest of my child. That's what this is about. I don't need to win. I can lose. The parent, I don't need to win. I don't need to be right. I need to get what my child needs, so long as I'm pretty sure that I'm right with what they need. That the people I trust are corroborating. We all agree. Last year's classroom teacher, me, my spouse, right? All of us. Yes, this is not a character flaw. Wow, it's never a character flaw. And no, this is what we're asking for is a reasonable intervention. Maybe it won't work, but it's a reasonable, and potentially meaningful intervention to help Eric, Jenny, whoever it is, to be more successful. And that's what it's supposed to be about. I hope that helps to clarify a little bit. Any other questions or comments from anybody?
No, I think that's it. I
We
think we've
we did
answered that.
have
Oh yeah,
we
go
did
ahead.
have one comment, I mean one question in the chat. I don't know if do we have time for that? I want to also respect your time too,
Hey,
Dr.
sure. No, that's okay.
Yeah. So it was in the chat, not the Q&A section. But asked, so their 9-year-old son has TS, ADHD, and OCD, also complex vocal tics. How can the related services such as OT, like occupational therapy, support my son? And how do I support them in accessing resources to support my son if they are unaware? And along those lines too. It is my understanding that the Individual Disability Education Act enlists Tourette syndrome as a qualifying disability under the category of other health impairment. Is this something schools are readily aware of, or should the parent provide education to the school on this?
Okay. So schools should be readily aware of this and many other things, but sometimes they're not. If they're not, you would want to make them aware of it, but it's their obligation to know about that. And more specifically to your question, look, first of all, you present, like again, it sounds like a pretty complex case. So it's difficult for me to answer specifically in that way, but I will say the following. My first, when I think of Tourette's, and I think it was OCD and ADD. I think I'm not sure why I would be thinking about OT. Now, maybe there's again, and that's where it goes back to the evaluation. That's why a diagnosis is only a starting point. It's only okay. That's where I start from. It's not where I end. It's where I start. It's the diagnosis tells me where to begin to do my research, how do I begin to think about this? And so what are the challenges that the child is manifesting? And so it's just not clear. It's not obvious to me why I would want to provide occupational therapy services. Now, I'm not an OT. By the way, I think OTs are great sometimes, so this is not about OTs, but I'm just not sure why OT, number one. Number two is, again, an occupational therapist should know where they can get resources for how an occupational therapist could be working with a child with fill in the blank. And if they don't know where to find the resources, to be perfectly blunt, I'm not sure I want them as my child's occupational therapist. Really. I mean, again, no professional knows everything. I consult with other professionals. Other professionals consult with me. None of us knows everything. But I, as a professional, it's my job. It's my job. It's my responsibility as a professional to know who to go to ask when I don't know something. It's an OT's job to know other OTs. Who's the supervisor? By the way, there's a supervising OT in the district. Go there. And that's common sense. Before you get to, OTs that I know, go back. You got your degree in occupational therapy. Did you not go to any of the classes and just take tests and not meet any of the professors who clearly have expertise in different areas? And you have none of them, you hated all of them, none of them, you had any regard for. None of them spoke about special education or different areas of disability as it relates to occupational therapy. You see what I'm saying? Like, the point is, I don't understand how an occupational therapist doesn't know where to start to think about this, even if they don't per se know what to do. So no, I don't think it's your job. And that's drilling down into the weeds. It may be, it's not your job. It's not your job, but you may be forced to go to the school or the school district and either make them aware or remind them of what they've conveniently forgotten about diagnoses and all sorts of other things. But I think it's not your job to train the OT or to find resources for the OT. And don't do it. You have a lot on your plate as a parent. Own what you need to own. Don't own what you don't need to own. And offhand, that's not something that I think you need to own. And then again, let me just reiterate, there might be a good reason for wanting OT for this child, for your 9-year-old, but I'm not sure what it is. At first glance, I don't know what it is. I might want a really good special ed teacher to be working with the teacher in terms of interventions to support the child. I might want a really good mental health professional to be guiding the teacher or to be providing, counseling to the student, maybe around some of the things that they're experiencing. The OT, I just, there may be good reason. I just don't know what they are offhand. I hope that answers a little bit.
Thank you,
Yeah,
Jeff.
I think that was all
Thank
the
you so
questions we
much.
had.
Okay,
Yeah.
so thank you everybody who's attended tonight. I hope that this was a little bit helpful. Certainly, I know TAA can be helpful to you, moving forward in your journey, and it's a journey. And if I can, let me just say one last thing. This is, and in some ways, this may sound counterintuitive to everything that I just said, but it's not. It's not, because opposites, really can live together. It's hard for us to get that, but it's true. School for your child is really important, but it's not their life. School is not a metaphor for life. School, unfortunately, sometimes is something just to be gotten through. I say that as somebody who I am a passionate. I believe in education. I love teaching. I love teaching children. I love working. I really do. And I love training teachers and trying to get them to to be to see. But you need your first. I would respectfully suggest to you that your first charge as a parent, as it relates to school, is, to the degree that you can, is to make sure that your school does your child no harm. Right? Doctors, medical professionals, their credo is do no harm. That should be educators. That should be teachers. Do no harm. We can do harm. You as the parent, that is your responsibility. If you believe that harm, I didn't say if you believe your child's not getting everything that they possibly could or should. I said, if you believe that harm, if your child, somebody said in some of the questions, traumatized, if your child's been traumatized, if your child's coming home crying, if your child is, like those kinds of things are happening on some kind of regular basis, they're being harmed and you don't want it. And then you really need to step in. But just remember, there are lots of kids who, unfortunately, it doesn't have to be this way, but it is this way, who go through school, and school is not a great place for them, and go on to life to have really wonderful lives. Okay? School is one dimension. Your home, your parenting, your family life is just as important, and probably more important, to the nurturing and the development and the building blocks to who your child is going to become and what kind of life they're going to have. Which is not to say, and that's why you came tonight, but we want to get as much as we reasonably can after we protect our children out of school. And so now, hopefully after tonight, hopefully you're a little bit more informed or knowledgeable and in a better position to do that. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Lichtman. What a really special treat. Thank you for your words. I hang on to them as a parent with a son who's 17, with Tourette, now a senior in high school, right? Everything that you said, it just rings so true. So thank you. And the people that have been on tonight and have had the opportunity to listen to you are very fortunate. So we're fortunate that you did this for us. Thank you very much. Everybody, thank you for being on. Enjoy your nights, and please, see in the chat the support at Tourette.org, some of the resources that Eric put in. The Pacer bullying resources are incredible. I don't want to be the person that says just read the resources and you're done. So please reach out to us. We can guide you for sure. we have a lot of volunteers. Eric knows too. He's helping us lead the charge here. And Eric actually is, as a young adult, even in college, was one of our, and still is one of our education volunteers. So it's an amazing, we have an amazing kind of network here at the TAA. And now Dr. Lichtman is on our Education Advisory Board, and he's part of that network, leading the way for us as well. So thank you all again, and please enjoy your evening. Everybody get some rest, and hopefully this helped put you a little bit more at ease if you are one of the parents on that has been struggling. Thank you again.
Good night.
Good night.